The air inside the train car was thick with the smell of old upholstery and the metallic tang of cold winter air that seemed to seep through the very seams of the windows. I didn't realize that being the last passenger on the line meant I was also the only witness to something that was never supposed to be seen by the public. The rhythmic thumping of the wheels against the tracks usually felt like a lullaby, but tonight, as we plunged into the pitch-black tunnels of the outer city limits, that sound transformed into a heavy, industrial heartbeat that matched the frantic pulsing in my own chest. I sat in the very last car, my breath hitching every time the overhead fluorescent lights flickered, casting long, jerky shadows that seemed to dance and stretch across the empty seats like reaching fingers. It started when the train made an unscheduled stop in the middle of a barren stretch of wasteland where no station had existed for decades. I looked out the window, pressing my forehead against the freezing glass, but all I could see was the reflection of my own pale, terrified face staring back at me against the backdrop of an endless, snowy void. There were no platform lights, no signs of life, and yet, I heard the heavy hydraulic hiss of the doors opening 3 cars ahead of me. The silence that followed was absolute, a crushing weight that made my ears ring, until the sound of heavy, rhythmic footsteps began to echo through the hollow metal tube of the train. They weren't the footsteps of a conductor or a commuter. They were slow, deliberate, and carried the weight of someone who wasn't worried about being caught. I pulled my legs up onto the seat, trying to make myself as small as possible, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it felt like it might bruise the bone. Who would be boarding a dead-end commuter train at 2 in the morning in the middle of a frozen field? I peered through the small glass pane of the door connecting my car to the next one, and that was when I saw them. 2 men in heavy, dark utility jumpsuits were dragging a long, industrial-grade plastic bag down the aisle, the sound of the plastic sliding against the linoleum floor making a sickening, dry, rasping noise that filled the entire carriage. They weren't speaking, and their movements were methodical, almost professional, as if they had done this exact task 1,000 times before in the dead of night. I ducked down behind the high back of my seat, my fingers digging into the worn fabric until my knuckles turned white. I could hear them getting closer, the sliding door between the cars screeching open with a violent metallic groan that sent a bolt of pure adrenaline through my system. The temperature in my car dropped instantly as the cold air from the vestibule rushed in, and I held my breath until my lungs screamed for oxygen, terrified that even the slightest exhale would give away my position. I heard one of them grunt as they hoisted the heavy weight of the bag, and then the sound of metal scraping against metal as they opened the floor trapdoor used for engine maintenance. Why were they using a public transit line as a disposal site? And more importantly, what would they do if they found out the empty train wasn't actually empty? My mind raced through every possible exit, but I was trapped in a moving cage of steel and glass with nowhere to run and no one to call for help. My phone was dead, a useless slab of glass in my pocket, and the emergency cord was located right next to where the 2 men were currently standing. I watched through the gap between the seats as they finished their grim task, their faces obscured by shadows and heavy scarves, making them look like faceless ghosts in the flickering light. Just as they were about to close the hatch, one of them stopped, his head tilting to the side like a predator catching a scent in the wind. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the rows of empty seats, and for a split second, I was certain he was looking directly at the spot where I was hiding. My blood turned to ice, and I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to a god I hadn't spoken to in years that the shadows would be deep enough to swallow me whole. I heard him take a step toward my row, the floorboards creaking under his boots, and the smell of grease and stale tobacco grew stronger as he approached. "Did you hear that?" the man asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like grinding stones. His partner didn't answer immediately, and the silence that stretched between them was more terrifying than any threat he could have shouted. I felt the vibration of his footsteps through the floor, a slow, steady thud, thud, thud that felt like a countdown to the end of my life. He was only 2 rows away now, and I could hear his heavy, rhythmic breathing, a wet, rattling sound that suggested he was just as cold-blooded as the task he had just performed. Suddenly, the train lurched forward with a violent jolt, the wheels screeching as the power surged back into the engines. The man stumbled, swearing under his breath, and the distraction was enough to make his partner call out from the other end of the car. "Forget it, we're behind schedule and the next signal is coming up. We need to move now." I heard the man hesitate, his presence lingering near my seat for a few more agonizing seconds before he finally turned and retreated toward the next carriage. The door slammed shut behind them, and I slumped against the wall, my body shaking so violently that I had to bite my lip to keep from sobbing out loud. I knew I wasn't safe yet, as the train was now moving at full speed toward the final depot, a place where these men likely had more associates waiting for them. If I stayed on until the end of the line, I would be walking straight into their hands at the maintenance yard. I had to get off, but the train was a blur of gray and black speed against the night, and jumping would be a death sentence. I crept toward the back of the car, my eyes fixed on the door they had just exited, watching for any sign of their return. I noticed the manual override lever for the emergency doors, a red handle tucked behind a glass casing that looked like it hadn't been touched in 20 years. I reached for it, but my hand stopped midair when I heard the muffled sound of voices returning from the car ahead. They were coming back to check, or perhaps they had found my bag left in the previous car, or maybe they just had a gut feeling that they weren't alone. The panic was a living thing now, clawing at my throat, and I knew I only had one chance to survive this night. I grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall bracket, my muscles screaming with the effort, and smashed the glass casing of the emergency lever with a deafening shatter that seemed to echo for miles. The alarm didn't sound, but the hiss of the pneumatic brakes began to scream as the train fought against its own momentum. The doors didn't open fully while the train was moving, but they cracked just enough for me to see the snowy embankment flying past. I saw the shadow of the door at the other end of the car beginning to slide open, and the silhouette of the man with the gravelly voice appeared. His face twisted in a mask of pure rage when he saw me. I didn't think, I didn't hesitate. I simply threw the fire extinguisher at his feet to trip him up and lunged through the narrow gap of the sliding exterior doors. The world became a whirlwind of freezing air and stinging snow as I tumbled down the steep embankment, my body bouncing off the hard-packed earth until I finally came to a rest in a ditch filled with dead brush. I lay there, gasping for air, the taste of copper in my mouth and the sting of 100 scratches on my face, watching as the train groaned to a halt a few hundred yards down the track. I saw the flashlights beginning to scan the woods from the rear of the train, the beams of light cutting through the darkness like searchlights in a prison camp. I crawled deeper into the brush, moving as silently as a ghost through the shadows, my heart still racing but my mind focused on one thing: survival. I found an old drainage pipe and tucked myself inside, watching as the men searched the perimeter for 10 minutes before the sound of a distant police siren, likely triggered by the emergency brake deployment, sent them scrambling back onto the train. The engine roared back to life, and the metal beast began to crawl away into the night, leaving me alone in the freezing silence. I waited until the red tail lights vanished into the horizon before I stood up, shivering and bruised, and began the long walk toward the distant glow of the city lights. I was alive, but I knew I would never be able to close my eyes on a train again without hearing the sound of that plastic bag sliding across the floor. The digital display above the platform flickered with a cold, blue light that seemed to drain the color from everything it touched. I was standing alone on the edge of the yellow safety line, my breath forming thick, white clouds in the midnight air, while the distant hum of the high-speed rail began to vibrate through the soles of my shoes. I didn't want to be on this train, but the last flight out of the city had been canceled, and the 6-hour journey through the rural heartland was my only way to get home before dawn. When the sleek, silver nose of the train finally slid into the station, it looked less like a vehicle and more like a silent, metallic predator cutting through the fog. I boarded carriage 7, expecting the usual comfort of a premium cabin, but as the doors hissed shut behind me, I realized I was the only soul in the entire section. I walked down the narrow aisle, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, searching for my assigned seat, 14A. When I reached the row, I stopped dead in my tracks. A small, handwritten note was taped to the headrest of my seat, the ink still looking fresh and dark under the harsh LED lights. It didn't say reserved or out of order like a normal railway notice would. It simply said, "I have been waiting for you, Sarah." My blood went cold instantly, a sharp, prickling sensation crawling up the back of my neck because my name is Sarah, and there was no possible way a stranger could know I was on this specific train. I looked around the empty cabin, my eyes darting from the dark windows to the heavy sliding doors at the end of the car, but there was nobody there. I tried to tell myself it was a prank, perhaps a friend who knew my travel plans, but the silence of the train was too heavy, too oppressive for a joke. I moved 3 rows back and sat in a different seat, pressing my back against the cold plastic and staring at the note on 14A. The train began to move, a smooth, terrifyingly fast acceleration that made the dark landscape outside blur into a streak of nothingness. I opened my laptop, hoping the glow of the screen would offer some sense of normalcy, but as soon as the operating system loaded, a message notification popped up in the corner of my screen. It wasn't an email or a work alert. It was a simple text file that had been remotely dropped into my shared folder. The file was titled "Look Behind You," and the sheer audacity of the threat made my heart skip a beat before slamming against my ribs like a trapped bird. I didn't look back. Couldn't. I kept my eyes fixed on the screen, my fingers trembling so violently that I could barely hold the mouse. I began to type a message to the train's emergency Wi-Fi portal, desperate for a connection to the outside world. But as I typed the words, "Help me," the letters began to disappear from the screen one by one. It was as if someone was hitting the backspace key on a secondary keyboard, watching my every keystroke in real time. Every time I tried to call for help, the screen would go blank, replaced by a single sentence in a giant, bold font. "Sit back in seat 14A, Sarah." The psychological weight of being watched by an invisible observer was becoming unbearable, and the cabin felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in on me with every mile we covered. I stood up, determined to find the conductor, but as I reached the heavy glass door leading to carriage 8, I found it was electronically locked from the other side. I turned around to head toward carriage 6, but that door too remained shut, the red locked light glowing like a malevolent eye. I was trapped in a single car, moving at 200 miles per hour through a dark wilderness where no one could hear me scream. I looked toward the small observation window in the door, and for a fleeting second, I saw a tall, thin silhouette standing in the shadows of the vestibule, just watching me. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, draped in a long, dark coat that made it blend perfectly into the gloom. I backed away, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps that sounded like thunder in the quiet car. I realized then that the stranger wasn't just on the train. They were controlling the environment, using the train's own internal network to isolate me and break my will. I returned to seat 14A, realizing that if I didn't follow the instructions, the situation would only escalate. As soon as I sat down, the overhead speakers crackled to life, but instead of an announcement, I heard the sound of my own voice from a phone call I had made earlier that day. It was a recording of me telling my mother that I would be home late, and hearing my own casual, happy tone played back to me in this nightmare made me feel physically ill. The intruder was showing me how much access they had to my life, peeling back my privacy like layers of skin. I looked at the window reflection and saw the door at the end of the car slowly slide open. The silhouette stepped into the light, and I realized he wasn't a ghost or a monster, but a man with a calm, terrifyingly blank expression. He held a small electronic device in his hand, a signal jammer that explained why my phone had no service and why the doors were malfunctioning. "You shouldn't have moved seats," he said, his voice surprisingly soft, which made it 10 times more frightening than a shout. He began to walk toward me, his movements slow and rhythmic, matching the swaying of the train as we hit a curve in the tracks. He wasn't rushing because he knew I had nowhere to go. I looked around desperately for a weapon, my eyes landing on my heavy glass water bottle on the tray table. I gripped the neck of the bottle, my knuckles white, waiting for him to get close enough for me to strike. He stopped 3 rows away, tilting his head as if he were studying a specimen in a jar. "I've been following your digital trail for months, Sarah, and tonight is the night we finally close the loop," he whispered, stepping into the row directly in front of me. He reached out a hand, his fingers long and pale, as if he intended to touch my face. In that moment, the fear that had been paralyzing me turned into a sharp, jagged spark of survival. As he leaned over the seat, I didn't scream, I acted. I lunged forward, swinging the heavy glass bottle with every ounce of strength I had left, aiming for the side of his head. The glass didn't break, but the impact was solid, a dull thud that sent him reeling back into the aisle. He groaned, clutching his temple, and I didn't wait to see if he would get up. I grabbed my laptop bag and ran toward the emergency equipment locker at the back of the car, remembering the manual release tool I had seen in a safety video once. I smashed the plastic cover with my heel, the sound of breaking shards filling the air, and grabbed the heavy metal T-bar inside. Behind me, I heard the man scrambling to his feet, his breathing now heavy and jagged with pain and fury. "You're going to regret that," he hissed, his footsteps drumming against the carpet as he charged down the aisle toward me. I shoved the T-bar into the manual override slot of the floor-level emergency hatch, twisting it with a desperate, gut-wrenching force. The gears groaned, protesting the sudden movement, but the hatch finally popped open, revealing the rushing blur of the tracks beneath the train. The noise was deafening, a roar of wind and steel that swallowed my senses. The man was only feet away now, his hand reaching for my coat, his face twisted into a snarl of pure malice. I didn't jump into the tracks, that would be suicide, but I used the T-bar to jam the sliding doors mechanism just as it began to close on his arm. He screamed as the heavy automated door slammed into his limb, pinning him against the frame. The electronic system, sensing an obstruction, began to cycle the door open and shut repeatedly, giving me the window of time I needed. I scrambled past him into the vestibule and used the T-bar to wedge the door to carriage 6 open. I sprinted through the next 3 cars, screaming for help, until I finally burst into the buffet car where a group of late-night workers were cleaning the counters. They looked up in shock as I collapsed onto the floor, sobbing and pointing back toward the dark carriages behind me. The train staff immediately called the transit police and moved me into the secure conductor's cabin. When we reached the next station, the police swarmed carriage 7, but the man was gone, leaving behind only the signal jammer and the handwritten note that had been waiting for me. They found his dark coat discarded in the maintenance crawl space, and though they didn't catch him that night, I was safe under the bright, protective lights of the station. I realized then that the most dangerous thing about the modern world isn't the shadows, but how easily someone can use our own lives to trap us in a corner with no escape. The cold steel of a serrated blade was pressing into the soft skin of my throat before I even had the chance to open my eyes or realize that the rhythmic rocking of the train was no longer a comfort, but a countdown. I didn't dare to breathe, let alone scream, because the person leaning over my narrow bunk in the darkness of the sleeper car was exhaling a slow, sour heat that told me they had been watching me sleep for a very long time. The cabin was pitch black, save for the occasional flash of a passing signal light that sliced through the gap in the curtains like a strobe, illuminating a pair of gloved hands and the dull reflection of metal. I was trapped in a tiny, rectangular box of wood and fabric, hurtling through the desolate countryside at 80 miles per hour, and the only thing between me and a shallow grave in the woods was the thin, trembling hope that this man wanted my money more than my life. It had started as a perfectly normal journey on the cross-country night express, a trip I had taken a dozen times before to visit my family during the winter holidays. I had boarded at 10 o'clock, hauling my heavy suitcase into cabin 4B and locking the door with the standard deadbolt that the porter assured me was the height of railway security. I remember the feeling of the crisp, white sheets and the way the heater hummed a low, mechanical tune that eventually lulled me into a deep, unsuspecting slumber. But now, as I stared up into the featureless void where a face should be, I realized that the deadbolt I had carefully turned was still engaged, yet the intruder was inside with me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. He hadn't broken in through the door. He had been waiting under the lower bunk the entire time I was getting ready for bed. "Don't make a sound, or the next bump in the tracks will be the last thing you ever feel," the voice whispered, a low, distorted growl that sounded like it was being filtered through a thick layer of fabric. I felt the mattress dip as he shifted his weight, his knee pinning my hip against the wall of the train car so that I couldn't roll away or kick out. My heart was a frantic, trapped animal in my chest, thudding with such violence that I was certain he could feel the vibration through the blade. Why was he doing this? I was just a student with a cheap laptop and a few $100s in my wallet, hardly a target worth this level of calculated, terrifying effort. The intruder reached into his pocket with his free hand, and I heard the unmistakable crinkle of plastic, followed by the pungent, chemical odor of something that smelled like industrial cleaning fluid. He was going to drug me, to ensure that I wouldn't be a witness to whatever he was planning to do once the train reached the next desolate stretch of forest. I knew that if that cloth touched my face, I would never wake up again, or if I did, it would be in a place where no one would ever find me. I had to act, but the claustrophobia of the bunk was paralyzing. The ceiling just inches above my head and the wall pressing into my back like a cold, indifferent tombstone. "Please," I managed to choke out, my voice cracking with a terror that I didn't recognize as my own. "Just take the bag. It's on the floor. Take everything and go." The blade pressed a fraction harder, a warning that silenced me instantly, and I felt a single drop of blood begin to crawl down my neck, a warm contrast to the freezing air in the cabin. He didn't want the bag. He wanted something else, or perhaps he just enjoyed the absolute power he held over a helpless stranger in the middle of the night. The train began to slow down as we approached a long tunnel, the sound of the wheels changing from a steady hum to a deafening, echoing roar that filled the small cabin and drowned out the sound of my own frantic breathing. In the darkness of the tunnel, the intruder became a complete shadow, and I realized this was my only chance to catch him off guard while he couldn't see my movements. I waited for the exact moment the train hit the transition of the tracks, a sharp lurch that always happened near the tunnel's exit. When the jolt came, I didn't pull away from the knife. I lunged forward, grabbing his wrist with both hands and twisting with every ounce of desperate, adrenaline-fueled strength I possessed. The blade skidded across my collarbone, slicing through my pajamas but missing the vital vein in my neck by a mere fraction of an inch. He let out a muffled grunt of surprise, his balance compromised by the swaying of the carriage, and he fell backward toward the small vanity mirror. I didn't stop to see if he was hurt. I scrambled out of the bunk, my bare feet hitting the cold floorboards as I lunged for the door. My fingers fumbled with the deadbolt, the metal feeling slick with sweat and my own blood, and for a terrifying second, the lock wouldn't budge. Behind me, I heard him scrambling to his feet, the sound of his heavy boots thudding against the carpet as he lunged for my hair. I felt his fingers brush against the back of my neck just as the bolt finally clicked open, and I threw myself into the narrow, dimly lit corridor of the sleeper car. I didn't run toward the back of the train, knowing that the doors at the end of the line were often locked at night. Instead, I sprinted toward the dining car, screaming for help at the top of my lungs. The corridor felt miles long, the flickering yellow lights overhead making the doors of the other cabins look like a blur of brown wood and polished brass. I could hear him behind me, the heavy, rhythmic thud of his footsteps gaining ground because he was taller and stronger than I could ever hope to be. I reached the heavy glass door of the dining car and slammed my weight against it, bursting into the room where a lone night porter was polishing glasses behind the bar. The porter looked up in horror as I collapsed onto the floor, clutching my bleeding neck and pointing back toward the dark hallway I had just escaped from. "Someone is in my cabin. He tried to kill me," I shrieked, the words tumbling out in a jagged, incoherent mess. The porter didn't hesitate. He reached under the counter for a heavy iron emergency tool and stepped in front of me just as the intruder appeared at the glass door. The man in the mask stopped, his eyes meeting mine through the glass for one final, chilling moment, before he turned and vanished back into the shadows of the sleeper car. The porter called the conductor and the transit police over the radio, and the train was brought to an emergency halt at the next signal crossing in the middle of a snowy field. The police searched every inch of the train, but the intruder had managed to pull the emergency release on the rear vestibule door and vanish into the night before the authorities could surround the cars. When they inspected my cabin, they found a small, hidden compartment under the floorboards that I hadn't even known existed, containing a stash of stolen passports and high-value jewelry from previous passengers. The man hadn't been targeting me for my money. I had simply been sleeping on top of his hidden treasure, and he had come back to claim it at any cost. I spent the rest of the night in the brightly lit station office, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket and sipping lukewarm coffee while the sun began to rise over the horizon. I was safe. The wound on my neck was shallow enough to only require a few stitches, and the police assured me that they had found fingerprints that would lead to an arrest. But as I watched the next train pull into the station, its silver skin gleaming in the morning light, I knew that the sound of a locking door would never again feel like enough to keep the world out. I walked away from the tracks, my heart finally slowing down, but my eyes remained fixed on the shadows, wondering how many other secrets were hiding beneath the floorboards of the world's most beautiful journeys.